Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I want to thank and welcome very warmly Professor Edward Baring, who is speaking to us this evening. Well, good day, Ed, I'll say. That's what we have in common. So Professor Baring and I always begin by saying a bit of how we know each other. So we started at Queen's College, Cambridge in 1999. And two things were very evident about Professor Baring. One, that he was quite clearly brilliant, intellectually brilliant, started out as a very fine mathematician and then became a very fine historian, which he still is to this day. The second one is he's very nice. And you can tell he's particularly nice because he's got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, his time, in order to speak to us, which is extremely kind of him. And I know we're all very grateful. He's an intellectual historian, specializing in 20th century European intellectual history, and is now an associate professor in history and human values at Princeton University, which, as I'm sure people are aware, is one of the leading universities in the world, an Ivy League college in Britain, in America, and a very impressive place to have a place in the faculty. The topic is Derrida Judaism. Derrida is one of Professor Baring's special areas. But as always, I want to start by just asking Professor Baring to just tell us about himself and his life, and from his beginnings in England through to university and then beyond into the groves of academe.
Great. Yes, well, thank you very much, Rabbi Elton, for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure. It was very nice to receive an email from him earlier in the year. So we've seen each other a couple of times. You knew him very, very well in good friends at Cambridge together, and then we last saw each other about maybe 6-7 years ago. He came and visited us here when he was studying in New York. So as he said, yes, I had a sort of it was a crooked path to where I am now. I started off studying mathematics, and but there's all the cool kids like Ben were studying history, and I thought so that's where I wanted to be. And so I changed to history, and because it was only halfway through the degree, and in Britain, I think like Australia, you only study one subject. It was a kind of a rapid change, and I was only studied history for 2 years, but I wanted to do something more, and so my advisor suggested that I go and go to America. And at first I thought I'm just going to sort of go there for the degree, get my PhD, but I met my wife in America. So it's always not necessarily always a good idea to meet your spouse in grad school, but I was very lucky, and we now have 3 children together. Almost 20 years after we started. So, but I was sort of searching for various things to work on, and so I landed on this figure. So Jacques Derrida, he's a figure who has really taken the academic world by storm. He's one of the most cited figures in the humanities over the past 20 or 30, 40 years in a range of different departments. But he's somebody who's always kind of resisted historical study. So, for instance, he has this fantastic archive. He's somebody who never threw a piece of paper away. But very few people had visited it. I remember when I first went there, he kept notes that he wrote to people in class while he was, sort of, do you want to get lunch afterwards? So he was somebody who in some ways is a historian's dream. And so my first book was an attempt to try and sort of place him in his historical context. And a lot of that was also religious context. And it was not something I was necessarily looking for at first. I remember when I first went through his archival material, I stopped at all the moments where I was interested in lots of other different things, and it was only after my first visit that I was trying to work through the material, that I started to realize that there was some important religious implications of his work. And then I realized that I had stopped at all the important essays where he talked about God or atheism or other religious topics. And so afterwards I went back and tried to piece together his philosophy and its and his place within a kind of a French intellectual scene. So I thought what I would do today is I thought I would start just to introduce Derrida's thought and then think through with you the kind of the relationships between his thinking and Judaism or Jewishness. There's a word that he uses, judaity, in his writing and it's a very sort of it's a sort of difficult topic for Derrida because it's something that he came on later on in his life, but also that he found he had a complex relationship with. So if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen so you all see that. So this is the picture of the man himself. This is Jacques Derrida, founder of the School of Deconstruction, and as I said, one of the most cited influential thinkers of the 20th century. And he was born in 1930 in Algeria, so the French colony of Algeria. And he attended secondary school in Algiers, but he wanted to be a writer. And in the French Empire at that time, if that's what you wanted to do, then you needed to go to Paris. And he landed in 1949 in the center of the of academic Paris. This is the picture of the left bank, this of the so-called Quartier Latin, and this is where every major institution of French intellectual life happens. It's you realize how small it is. This is basically a square mile, but you have, and this is where the Sorbonne is, the Collège de France, which is where the most eminent French academics from across disciplines come together. The most important universities, the École Polytechnique for the sort of sciences and engineering, and the École Normale Supérieure for arts and humanities, also mathematics. The most important sort of feeder schools of the lycée for those institutions, the Lycée Louis le Grand and Lycée Henri IV. And even if you look in the top left-hand corner, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which is where Jean-Paul Sartre would sit in cafes with Albert Camus and Simone de Beauvoir. So they're all basically within walking distance. So this is a small village. And as a 19-year-old, Derrida found himself right in the heart of it. He attended the Lycée Louis le Grand. He got a scholarship there straight from Algiers in 1949. And after 3 years of study there, he found his home at the École Normale Supérieure, which has trained the large majority of important French philosophers, historians, mathematicians over the past 2 centuries. And when he was there, he was, friends with, some of the kind of the leading lights of his generation, like Michel Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, the French, this is basically the most important figure in French sociology in the 20th century, Michel Serres, and others. So this is a picture of him. I thought this is him when he's 19. That's my greatest archival find, because if you look very closely, you can see he's wearing Converse trainers. A very stylish young man. So he graduates from the École Normale Supérieure. He teaches, as many did, in lycée for a while. He was sent away from Paris, didn't like that at all. He spent some time in Harvard, and like many at the time during the Algerian War, he was sent to do his military service, where he taught in a military school in Algeria for a couple of years. But he made his way, like many French intellectuals. He wanted to be back in Paris, and he made his way back in the 1960s, and he got a position teaching back again at the École Normale Supérieure. So this is really the heart, the pinnacle of French intellectual life. And it's not only just the kind of the institution at the center of French intellectual life, but it's also at a time, probably one of the intellectually most exciting times to be there, if you're a philosopher. So when he's there, he's teaching alongside Louis Althusser, who is one of the most influential Marxist philosophers of the 20th century, who sort of revolutionized Marxist thought and was picked up across the world in the 60s and 70s and beyond. Also at that time, Jacques Lacan, who is kind of the second most important psychoanalyst after Freud, he'd just been kicked out of a school he set up because he wasn't necessarily a fun person to work with, but he'd been, so he was looking for a home, and he found a home at the École Normale Supérieure and taught his seminar there for a number of years. But it's also, this is a period where he was teaching some of the students who would go on to be the leading lights of the next generation. So a number of figures who are now very, stars in the French academic firmament, like Alain Badiou, Etienne Balibar, Jean Nancy, they're kind of circulating, you can imagine, on the second floor where all these classrooms are. So they're circulating between the classrooms of these various different figures. So it's a very, very sort of exciting time to be here. And it's also a time when, Paris and intellectual life is at the center of, so world history, basically. This is just before the events of 1968, the student revolt, student worker revolt of May 1968, where poetry, as they say, took to the streets, and resistance against what they saw as kind of an oppressive French state, which was at the heart of a range of different protest movements around the world in 1968. So this is where Derrida is, and at the moment he's a relatively unknown figure, but in 1967 he published his 3 books, which, as any academic will tell you, is an enormous achievement in itself. But that sort of that thrust him into the intellectual limelight. And the most important one was this book called De la Grammatologie. It seems to be a very, very specific, dry academic title. It's using a word which most people have never heard of before, grammatology. But it's set into motion a kind of a new way of reading that transformed the humanities worldwide afterwards. And it's set in what's come to be known, a word that picked up as deconstruction. So deconstruction is the name which is very closely associated with Derrida, and it's in some ways to understand his relationship to Judaism and the Jewish tradition. It's the first stage to trying to understand what this thing deconstruction is, and basically it starts off with a number of principles, and he thinks that when we approach the world, we have the tendency to like neat, prettily tied up pictures where there are no loose ends, that they're unified and coherent worldviews, that everything fits together nicely. And he calls this tendency the sort of the metaphysics of presence. You can imagine everything fits together, is present at the same time without any ruptures or contradictions. And he thinks that in order to do this, we organize our thought using a range of hierarchical oppositions. So, whether it's presence versus absence, or the material versus the ideal, the rational versus the passionate, civilized versus the barbaric, free versus determined. And these can be used in different ways. But generally, he thinks that we tend to organize our thought by a kind of a dominant term, one that is we regard as having greater ethical value, perhaps, but perhaps even some ontological value. It's more real. So perhaps you might be a materialist. You think that matter is what it's all about, and ideas or the spirit perhaps are either secondary or perhaps non-existent. Or you could do it the other way around. You could say that actually sort of the ideal realm is the most real. This is like Plato, and the material world is merely just a secondary and poor reflection of it. And so he thinks that this is the way in which we create for ourselves these, you know, sort of clear, coherent, unified pictures of the world. And this is his wager. He says, well, this unity and coherence is an illusion. It's a dream that we have, and it's just not true. And for this reason, if you're really smart, he thinks, as you try and work out, as you try and build these pictures, you'll be forced to overstep the boundaries of your thoughts. You'll be forced to do things that don't quite fit into the picture that you've set up. And often the hierarchies you've set up, you might have to overturn them. And so the idea is this, that incoherence and contradiction, this isn't just, you know, error or mistake. This is actually when people are being most brilliant. You know, so I know if you have, you know, children or you know, grandchildren who are doing essays for work, and you see something that is, you know, they show you something which is full of contradictions and errors, you can now realize that this is a sign of their brilliance and their rigor, rather than vice versa. So I mean, let's sort of take an example. So one of the examples I like the most for explaining this idea is in 1991, Derrida starts talking about Karl Marx. He hadn't really talked about Marx beforehand, but for various reasons in the 1990s, he's turned to Marx to think about as somebody to sort of to engage with in this way. And of course, you know, Marx is a materialist. So what does that mean? It means that he's pretty skeptical of religion. He thinks it's, you know, the famous the opiate of the masses. He certainly is not superstitious. It also means that he thinks that explanations of social change that emphasize like real material things, like, you know, machines and social relations, and those are real explanations for change, whereas people who try and explain social change by ideas or states of mind, that's a sort of secondary, that's a less good explanation. So therefore we have this clear hierarchy that matter is what matters and everything else is secondary to it. And so he's certainly someone who doesn't believe in ghosts, you know, for all these things. And yet, if you open up, you know, your Marx, this 19th century rationalist, and let's go to the most famous text that he ever wrote. He wrote with Friedrich Engels in 1848, the Communist Manifesto. And you don't have to look very far. You look for the first noun in this piece, and there you are. You have a ghost. Already, this man who doesn't believe in ghosts suddenly finds himself writing about them. And you can say, well, okay, well, maybe this is a metaphor. Maybe this is just, maybe this is a one-off. You know, he slipped up. He dropped in a ghost, but it doesn't really mean much. He's just setting up a scene. But then Derrida says, if you actually look throughout his work, you know, look through Das Kapital, look through a range of his writings from the beginning of his life to the end of his life, you see ghosts everywhere. The man who doesn't believe in ghosts can't stop himself writing about them. So for instance, money is a ghost form for Marx. So a central part of his idea. Capital itself, he talks, it's like it's a vampire, it's the living dead, it's dead labor, which is sucks living value out of living workers. So you have this sort of a constant discussion of these apparently superstitious elements. And what Derrida wants to say is, he said, again, this is not because Marx is slipping up. This is not an error. This is not, he's not thinking poorly. This is when he's following the logic of his thinking, even if it's taking him in a place that he really doesn't want to go. And he says, so generally, because we are found in the metaphysics of presence, we don't like these things. They don't like these moments of contradiction of what Derrida calls them scandals. They don't fit, they don't work. And so what we do is try and push them into the sides. We push them into footnotes. Hopefully nobody reads them. We say that they're metaphors. Maybe we try and ignore them. Maybe we try and skip over them quickly. But for Derrida, these moments of scandals open up a possibility of new readings. And so here, so this is in some ways what deconstruction is. He said it's a form of close reading. You look through the text of traditions, the best and the brightest, not not perhaps your kids' school essays, but the highest forms of philosophical and other thinking that one can find. Plato, Aristotle, Hegel, Maimonides, Mendelssohn, others. And you scan these texts, you read them very, very closely. There was once an interview with this rather young, naive interviewer interviewed Derrida and asked, he was, as often in these cases, he's sitting in front of his bookshelf and there are all these books on the wall. And the interviewer says, oh, look at all those books. Have you read them all? And Derrida said, no, I've only read 2 of them, but those very carefully. And that's just not entirely true, but it tells you something about deconstruction, which is that you read very, very carefully, looking for these moments of scandal where the hierarchies the text sets up elsewhere, materialism and Marx, get challenged. And the kind of the wager is, he doesn't want to sort of predict in advance, but the wager is that if you read, excellent, powerful, rigorous thinkers, you will find them. That's the wager. And then what he wants to say is, well, what happens if we don't repress those moments as those thinkers have done? But what happens if we let them free? What happens if we follow that line of argument that led Marx to the spectre, that made him constantly return to it, and to develop it? And if we do that, we can deconstruct the text. We can draw out a second countervailing reading, a disruptive one that opens up new possibilities. So in some ways, this is this is a practice of reading, but it's also important. He wants to say it's not simply a technique, because he wants to say that it's already going on already in the text before you get there. It's not something you bring. Marx was already talking about spectres before you arrived, but you can perhaps sort of help him along his way and draw out these implications. And so this is a new, actually quite, in some ways, profoundly new way of reading. As before, we generally like forms of reading that emphasize coherence and harmony and reconcile moments of the text. You want to know, those bits that stick out, why they stick out, and perhaps find an explanation which suggests that they are part of a harmonious whole. But Derrida wants to push you in a very, very different direction. And this new way of reading texts it can be used almost anywhere. So it gets picked up in America. Derrida comes over for a conference in the 1960s, and his work within 10 years has sort of taken America by storm, in literary studies especially. Yale was an important heart of deconstruction, reading the text of the literary tradition in this way, but also in law, in political science, in sociology. So this is in some ways a disciplinarily nomadic form of reading. It can be applied to virtually anything. And it's also, part of the suggestion is that that might be emancipatory as well. That's what maybe perhaps the hope. Because if it's the case that we set up these hierarchies in texts, it could be that those hierarchies are related in some ways to social hierarchies. So, it's not too crazy to think that the opposition between reason and passion has been central to the way in which, say, women have been excluded from political power in Europe since in the modern period. Women were supposed not to be as rational or sufficiently rational as men, and so that was part of the argument why women didn't gain the vote in most European countries until the 20th century. And in France, not until 1944. So maybe if we can sort of deconstruct these texts to think about the way in which the priority of reason is perhaps undermined, constantly relying on notions of passion, we can find ways which are emancipatory for a range of different excluded social groups. So anyway, so what has this got to do with Judaism or Jewishness? Well, I mean, it's complex, but it wasn't too long before some of the proponents of Derrida's thought and also some of his critics started to suggest that perhaps there was something quintessentially Jewish about this form of thinking. So you can see there's kind of be a critical element in this, but also a celebratory one. Maybe some commentators thought maybe there's something that is that this is a particularly Jewish philosophy. So there are a number of ways of reading this. If Derrida wants to call attention to kind of an allergy towards difference and otherness in a kind of predominantly European tradition of writing, and because many presented the figure of the Jew as the kind of the quintessential other within European society, then this liberation of others, or perhaps even valorization of it, could be seen in this way as a Jewish philosophy. That might be one connection. The other thing is that because Derrida wants to draw our attention to the contradictory and self-undermining nature of our philosophical worldviews, many related that to kind of the ban on graven images, the sort of Bilderverbot of the Jewish tradition. There's also another kind of a moment which is, in some ways every scholar of the intellectuals of Europe has to grapple with, and Derrida had to grapple with himself, and that is the kind of the perennial problem of this guy, Martin Heidegger. So Martin Heidegger was one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. His work sort of revolutionized philosophy in Germany, but also beyond. He was an important figure for virtually every major subsequent thinker in Europe, his version of existentialism. But the great scandal of his thought is that in 1933, he joined the Nazi Party. And not only that, but as we know now, we've looked at his private notebooks, this isn't something where we can divide the personal from the philosophical. In his work, he explicitly, in his private notebooks, the so-called Schwarze Hefte, he explicitly connects his profoundly anti-Semitic worldview to his philosophical ideas. And this was a great shock. He wrote his first book in 1927, and lots of Jewish intellectuals especially saw in him a powerful and important new way of thinking. So Franz Rosenzweig, who was one of the leading figures in Jewish philosophy in Europe, died at the end of the 1920s, so didn't live to see Heidegger join the Nazi Party, but he identified in Heidegger a fellow thinker who walking along the same paths. And so one possibility, to grapple with Heidegger, and which is perfectly reasonable, is to say, well, let's just stop reading the guy anymore. This is sort of not, we should repudiate his thinking. But at least for many important Jewish thinkers, this was not possible. For Emmanuel Levinas, who is, in the French tradition, perhaps the most significant Jewish philosopher of the 20th century, he said Heidegger is like Mont Blanc. you may not like it, but it's there, and you have to deal with it. And especially to grapple with his own and others' early embrace of Heidegger, you have to work out what went wrong. You can't just reject it. You have to see where the error was, what it was that led him in this disastrous and reprehensible path. And for many, it was something like that there was something monological about Heidegger. It was a single voice that kind of shut out all other voices. And so Martin Buber, who is famous for his depiction of the I and thou, thinks that the I-thou relationship is shut out in Heidegger, and that's how we can see why he was led down this path to Nazism. He was, and for Emmanuel Levinas, it's this closure to the other, an unwillingness to open yourself up to other people. And that too led in this direction. And so Derrida as well, in quite similar ways, also wants to open up Heidegger to difference, to think about the ways in which his thought is both powerful, but also hostile to difference. And so deconstruction follows a trend of important Jewish thinkers, and often in direct dialogue with them for doing this. So that's, we can perhaps see why some critics wanted to suggest that there was something perhaps essentially Jewish about about Derrida's thought. But so Derrida didn't always jump at this. In an interview in the 70s, he posed a question. He says, in response to these readings, he said, certain American commentators have spoken of an influence of the Talmud. And Derrida said, yes, maybe, but I don't know the Talmud. So maybe, but it's difficult to understand how that could come about. Nevertheless, he picks up this ball and he runs with it. And so there's a range in the 1980s and beyond. He starts to pick up concepts and traditions from the Jewish traditions that he thinks are really that engage his thought and move it in a new direction. So just as a kind of a set of very brief examples, so he's very interested in the concept of election, or the notion of the kind of the chosen people. The way in which a particular group embodies and is granted a sort of a universal mission. And he sort of talks about this a lot, talks about Abraham at various moments in the 80s and 90s. He spent a lot of time, so I'm British, he's also talking about circumcision a lot, and what he's really interested about this is he thinks that he uses as a moment for thinking about the moment where one belongs to a community, based upon a mark on the body which sets you as part of a community. So he's really interested in the way in which identity and belonging are conferred. How is it that we come together and form a group? And there's something he thinks about circumcision that helps us understand that. And later on in his work, he becomes very much interested in this concept of messianism. So the notion of a messiah, particularly set against a kind of a Christian notion of messianism where the messiah has come. He's very interested in certain strands of Jewish messianism, where a messiah is to come. And he thinks that this grants to our thinking kind of an openness to the future, which is something that he feels is very, very important. So he's dealing with concepts that he's drawn from the tradition of Jewish philosophy. He's engaging with Jewish philosophers, especially, his great is Emmanuel Levinas. They are very close friends, and they are constantly engaging with each other's thought. He also then starts to, in the 1980s and beyond, he starts to talk a lot about his own life. And there he emphasizes his own Jewish heritage. So Derrida was born into a Sephardic family in North Africa. And he, in his first autobiographical writing called Circumcision, Circonfession, I mean, so he describes himself as a sort of black and very Arab Jew, referring to himself. And he's very interested in ways talking about his Jewish identity, which emphasize his marginality, his putting on the side of the edge of both French colonial community in North Africa and European society as a whole. And so he spends a lot of time talking about a moment in 1940 where it's just after the Nazi invasion of France, and the Vichy government has been installed, and there's a Vichy governor in Algeria. And in 1940, citizenship of all Algerian Jews was revoked. And so he was left without citizenship, sort of sans papier, without, and he was kicked out of his high school. And so this, obviously a kind of enormously traumatic moment is something that he returns to again and again in his writing. So it's pointing out those moments of the kind of precarity of his position, his marginality. And yet, as I suggest beforehand, with his, we should be a little bit suspicious. He does, it's only later in his life that he turns to these questions. And he turns to his understanding his Jewish identity as a way of explicating his philosophy. And so in some ways, we should be a little bit careful about trying to posit a cause here, because in some ways he's setting it up. He's narrating his past in a way in order to help us think through his philosophy. So in some ways, he's setting us up to understand it in this way. And in fact, if you read his work elsewhere, he, and especially at the time, as a young man, he emphasized not his marginality, but his belonging to the French Algerian community, and then to the French community. So the Sephardic Jews in North Africa were many lived in Algeria before the French invasion of 1830. And in 1870, Adolphe Crémière passes this decree, which grants citizenship to the Jewish population of Algeria. And this opened up a period of considerable assimilation into French Algerian society, so much so that it marked the very kind of religious practices. So Derrida tells us that in his family, circumcision was called baptism, and the bar mitzvah was called communion. And ironically, the moment where the precarity of their situation was revealed in 1940 with the revocation of their citizenship, and Derrida was kicked out of school, this was also a time when for many in the Sephardic community in North Africa, this marked a moment where they held on to their French identity even more closely, because it seemed so precarious. So Derrida himself, who refused to go to an alternative Jewish lycée, he rather spent his time playing football. And he said that there's a revocation of his citizenship created even stronger in him a desire for integration into the French community. So the question is, so how are we to, and he was particularly sort of, he was resistant to the embrace of a Jewish identity, which he felt had been kind of imposed upon him by the Vichy regime. And he found that this was, so how are we to kind of think about this? And I think one of the ways is to say, well, I think Derrida was most interested in mobilizing his Jewish identity as a way of undermining his strong senses of identity as a European thinker. So it's an alterity within the system. So as he later wrote, I am European, I am without doubt a European intellectual. I like to remember that, like to remind myself of that, but I am not, nor do I feel completely European. So he liked to emphasize his Jewish identity when it served to remind him of that not completely. And at the same time, he was very, very resistant to a kind of affirming Jewish as itself as kind of an alternative identity. So he was so Levinas, as his friend and interlocutor, emphasized the importance for young Jews to embrace the Jewish tradition. But Derrida was very resistant to this, and he resisted it himself. He didn't want to embrace Jewish identity. He wanted to resist as resistance to identity forms. I mean, as he asked, this of being Jewish is the answering, as he called, the answering of the call to another that puts oneself in question. So it's that which constantly leads to the questioning of your own identity. And so, the figure that he lands on, the one that he finds most interesting for thinking about his identity is that of the Marrano. This is something he lands on in the 1980s and engages with afterwards at multiple moments. So the Marranos is sort of a term which was coined in the 15th century to describe the Jewish communities in Spain and Portugal who, in that period were forced to convert to Christianity and yet who secretly engaged in Jewish religious practice. So we have a surface alignment with Christianity, but only at the surface. And of course, for this, they were the subject of great suspicion, especially from the Spanish Inquisition, who was looking to shore up the credentials of Spain as kind of a most Catholic nation. And for Derrida, the notion of the Marrano is all about, as I say, troubling identity. He thinks, so firstly, it shows resistance to assimilation narratives, because to say that one is a Marrano is to say that I am not yet assimilated. I have not fully been assimilated into the sort of Spanish Catholic community. But it's also somebody who it resists of also particularist narratives. He thinks that that is never also not fully Jewish. It's not as sort of there's not as in Derrida's understanding, there's not kind of a real Jewish identity underneath the Catholic one, but there's always the tension between the two. And there's also that so the very notion of Marrano I think he likes is sort of self-undermining too, because if to be Marrano is to be a crypto Judaism, then to say that you're Marrano then your Judaism is no longer hidden, and so you're no longer Marrano anymore. So to know you as Marrano is not to be a Marrano any longer. And I think he's interested in this because he thinks that in this way, the figure of the Jew, especially the Jew as Marrano, has something to teach everyone. That he wants to that we are all in some ways putting on a show for other people, trying to live up to ways of life that are not fully our own. And he wants to suggest that if we concentrate on that, we think about that aspect of our lives, that before we ask whether other people belong, whether other people are part of our community, it's worth reflecting on those moments where we don't truly belong ourselves, where we are never, ever fully at home. And that kind of humility, that can be the basis of an ethical system that makes us open to other people. So thank you. And there.
Well, thank you, Ed, so much. A really brilliant presentation, as I really expected it would be. Before I open it to the floor, the virtual floor, maybe I'll just make a couple of comments or questions and for you to maybe respond to. The first thing that comes to mind is I was actually teaching today a passage in the Maharal, Rabbi Yehuda Low of Prague, who's grappling with the idea of why are there so many opinions in the Jewish legal tradition. And he says essentially because plurality is inherent in the world. So everything which is pure has an element of impurity, and everything which is permitted has an element of forbiddenness. And one of those is dominant, and the dominant one leads you to the legal conclusion. This is forbidden, this is impure, this is kosher, this is not kosher. But those non-kosher, the impure, the not kosher, the forbidden is still present. It's a less dominant part of the whole, but it's still there. And when people are arguing, what they're doing is they're lighting on or noticing those non-dominant elements. And they might get that wrong. They think the non-dominant is dominant, which is why they take different sides. But they're both there. And arguments about people noticing different bits. And so by a great coincidence, the connections there. A couple of questions. What is the argument that the spectre haunting Europe is not just a metaphor? What's his response to the idea that it's not just a metaphor, and it's a useful metaphor, a metaphor he likes? We all have our favorite metaphors. And two, and this I think reflects the question in the chat, Derrida seems to be saying in your account that actually there are meanings, maybe multiple meanings, but texts have meaning. And yet Derrida is caricatured, and I think he was caricatured at Cambridge when we were there, as somebody saying, oh, there are no meanings. And you know, people like Quentin Skinner, who taught me and probably taught you, could be very dismissive. Oh, well, these Frenchies think, you know, texts don't have meanings, but we all know they really do have meanings. And yet he seems to be saying not that at all. Actually, you are excavating things which are really there.
No, I think, yes, thank you very much for those, you know, two questions. I mean, in the first one, I mean, it's certainly true. So Derrida is very closely related to postmodernism. So when people think about the terms, they relate the two very, very closely. It's a term he dislikes isms, you know, both in the way that all of us would dislike isms, you know, who wants to be placed into a box, but also because of his general resistance to being kind of classified. He thinks there's always a kind of violence to be classified. And certainly this notion that it's just, you know, it's a free-for-all, that you can just go there and you say what you like about a text. I mean, you know, so you can criticize lots of his readings, you can make mistakes, you can see where he makes mistakes, but he's very clear that these are meanings that are very much in there. There are multiple meanings. In some ways, very much like the sort of the example that Rabbi Elton just gave, that, you know, so there are different versions in the same text, that there's a plurality, but they are very much there, and it's our role to seek them out. And so that's, as in the case of Derrida's readings of Spectres of Marx. So I think, you know, he thinks that the reason why spectres are so important for Marx is ultimately because that although Marx emphasizes matter, he's very interested also in time. And time his depiction of matter makes it very hard to think about time. So he's interested in time in lots of ways. He's interested in kind of a future. He's interested in a different way of living that in some ways is revealed in the present. You know, communism is a spectre, i.e. we know about it now. Marx writes about it. He tells us about, not very much, but a little bit about, but in his model of society, if everything is related to the particular arrangement, social and economic arrangement as it is now, it's unclear precisely how these premonitions of the future could arise. So in that way, he's interested in the spectre is in some ways the spectre of the future that is hard to ally with his materialism. But also in his materialism as well is sort of stuck between times. Because the whole point about capitalism, you know, is that it's dead labor. So the idea is that, you know, you work, you earn some money, you put it aside, you invest it in, you know, a company, i.e. your labor from a year, 2 years, 10 years, 100 years ago, is as capital in the present. And so the very structure of capitalism has this temporal quality that is that, according to Derrida at least, Marx is required to leap out of a kind of a simple materialism, and turns him to these constant reapparition of these specters in order to describe it. So I think it's both, as I say, both it's the temporal qualities of Marx's theory that are just so central to him that sit uneasily with his materialism.
Well, thank you. Are there any questions from anyone on the call? Do not be shy. Well, while people summon up their courage, and when you have a question, please just unmute and ask. Can I just ask a sort of practical question? I mean, the mastery of languages you must have needed to do this work, from being a English-speaking mathematician to a multilingual historian. How did that happen, and how difficult was it?
Well, it's the joy about speaking languages and doing research in those languages. You also, that gives you a good reason to go and spend time in the countries. But and so that's a strong incentive to learn. So obviously, I understand read French, which I had from before I went to university, but also it involved reading lots of German. My wife is German. My German wasn't very good when I first met her. On our second date, I very cockily said, "If you'd like to continue this conversation in German, that's fine." And then she went, and I had to walk it back, which is very, very embarrassing. But over the years, it has enabled me to. And I think what's most interesting about these conversations is that, you know, we're talking about a French thinker who has been influential across the world, and that intellectual conversations are taking place on an international scale. And if that's one of the most exciting things about them, and so, you know, learning the languages is a way of you know, following these ideas and seeing what happens when they travel.
In terms of your own sort of current intellectual milieu, I think we in Australia hear lots of in that case, I shall withhold for a second, and I think there's actually a question coming.
Yeah. Yes.
Can I ask?
Yes, please.
Well, I have read that postmodernism emanates from Foucault, and I just wonder whether you can talk to that and show us how they're linked up, if indeed they are.
So they are. So Foucault and Derrida were. Foucault's a little bit older, and was there at the Economisperia with Derrida, and they're friends. There's a very big debate. Foucault writes the History of Madness, and he's very interested at that stage in trying to work out at particular moments the way in which we order our society to work out what counts as mad and what doesn't count as mad. And Derrida writes this criticism of that, which he basically, the criticism is that there's something, there's a failure to give a full explanation about how particular forms of rationality arise. And he gives this paper in 1962, and Foucault doesn't speak to him for 10 years afterwards. Derrida has this conversation. He wants to be, in some ways, he wants to read things that are in text. He wants to suggest multiple ways of developing ideas that he thinks are being sympathetic to the people he's reading. But the people he's reading are very rarely find it a sympathetic experience. And there are a lot of very, very angry people after Derrida has read them. So they are both often classed as post-structuralists, but there are profound differences in the way in which they understand what. Yes.
Dasha has asked, what are the early personal influences on Derrida, childhood, and I suppose you can broaden that out. Who are the people who matter to Derrida?
So I mean, there's a lot of people who are important. So I mean, there's his own childhood. He arrives in Paris, alone. I mean, this is 1949. You leave your family behind, and you maybe can phone. He's alone in this strange city. He becomes friends with Louis Althusser, so this Marxist philosopher who's also from Algeria, and they have this sort of personal connection. But they divide a lot on Marx. So Althusser is a revolutionary Marxist, and Derrida very much isn't. And so they have these big debates. So he has a fraught relationship with friends. He's also, I mean, one of the reasons why he chooses the Marano is that in his early life, he's very interested in Christian thinkers. So he reads a lot of St. Augustine. Also, he identifies with as a North African thinker. His high school teacher is a guy called Jan Sarnecki, who is a kind of a French Protestant thinker who guides his early readings, and he's very kind of this is going in some ways we can think of this. At a high school, there's a charismatic teacher who has an after school philosophy club, and this is very important for Derrida. So those are two very important figures. He's also, he comes into intellectual consciousness in 1940, late 1940s, and this is when Sartre is everywhere. And Sartre is one of historians is like a bomb. Like the bloke goes off, he's everywhere. There's fragments of Sartre all across the world. And so Derrida, as a 15, 16-year-old, is reading Sartre and is completely entranced by it. He worries that Sartre leads to kind of an ethical nihilism. And he's trying to work out how you can get out of that. But he's really interested in it. And I think one other just thing about being an Algerian expatriate is that this is also a period during the Algerian War. So the Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962, which is right at the kind of the moment of his intellectual formation. And his trying to think through the Algerian War is a very difficult moment in his life. He's wedded with the idea of a certain notion of French Algeria, which he sees as kind of in some ways has the potential to be a multi-ethnic community, but hasn't been. And he's resistant to kind of the nationalism that comes afterwards. And so that's struggling with what it would be to be, that wouldn't be a form of colonialism, but wouldn't be a form of nationalism. That is one of kind of the questions that arises in the Algerian War, is something that's also sort of guiding him in his struggles, that informs his thought.
And I think there's one last question from Robert Len. If you want to unmute yourself, Robert, and ask a question, please do.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Edward. That was fantastic. There is something that isn't clear, however, from your talk, and I wonder if you could clarify for me. Was Derrida's, was it a personal search for truth, or was it really just a delight in the intellectual, the excitement of the intellectual pursuit that he had stumbled upon? It's sort of, it's not clear to me at all from...
I mean, I think, he embraces, I think it's both actually, and he thinks that the two are related. So it is this, I mean, often he's presented as a kind of postmodernist, of anything goes, you just make it up as you go along, play a game. And I think Derrida doesn't think it's just a game. He thinks that actually that it's part of the truth of the world, that it is, that there are all these different contradictory elements that require us to play. So the play is very serious. The play is very truthful, he thinks. So he likes this notion of, he picks up from Heidegger, kind of like of the sort of the, of the gay science, the sort of fröhliche Wissenschaft, that it's a joyful science that is a game, because if you're rigorous and really try and understand how the world works, you realize that the world isn't a static structure. It is, there's considerable play, and so I think it's both. But he is very invested in truth. He just thinks that we have a false idea of what truth is. We want to make truth static. Was he tolerant of other interpretations of texts? I think so. I mean, I think he wants to say that there are multiple interpretations of texts that are all valid. That the danger is when you say it's mine and only mine that works, and it pops on everybody else. That's, I think, where he and he thinks that those moments where so you can develop your interpretation of text and it can be entirely valid in the sense that it is justified by the textual evidence, but that doesn't mean that it's the whole story. And so he's tolerant of other interpretations which draw on different forms of reading, but he is resistant to when people want to make that the whole story. And he, in some ways, he wants to let say, yes, you can have your interpretation of the text, if it's valid. One can be mistaken, one can make false interpretations of texts, but there are multiple true interpretations of texts, and one must be always wary of shutting out other ones just because you are satisfied with your own.
On that really pluralistic and tolerant and generous note, I want to thank Professor Bering. Ed, thank you so much for speaking to us our evening, your morning, and just wish you every success in all your research and also your personal family life. And we look forward to hearing good things from you. Yeah, well, Professor Rabbi Elton, thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a great pleasure to be here and talk to you. And yes, thank you. It was a great pleasure. I greatly enjoyed myself. Thanks, everybody. Look forward to having another conversation next month, and you all joining us then. Thanks very much. Have a good night, everybody.